Rome shivers in the winter of 59 BC, though the cold that grips the city runs deeper than seasonal winds sweeping down from the Seven Hills. In the shadowed corners of the Forum, moneylenders whisper about debts that could topple senators, while in marble villas overlooking the Tiber, patricians calculate the distance between their necks and the executioner's blade. The republic that conquered the Mediterranean trembles on the edge of civil war, its ancient institutions cracking under the weight of imperial ambitions and personal vendettas that will soon consume everything the ancestors built through centuries of disciplined expansion. Gaius Julius Caesar paces the floor of his residence on the Subura, studying maps of territories that exist beyond the edges of Roman knowledge, while creditors gather like vultures outside his door. The consul, who has spent his year in office systematically demolishing his enemy's legislation, owes 40 million denarii to men who measure friendship in silver and loyalty in interest rates. His debts exceed the annual revenue of entire provinces, accumulated through bribes, spectacles, and the ruinous expense of Roman politics, where offices must be bought before they can be exploited. At 40, Caesar faces the choice that destroys lesser men: bankruptcy and exile, or the desperate gamble of conquest that might crown him with glory or feed him to barbarian swords. The first triumvirate that rules Rome from behind senatorial facades meets in Caesar's garden as winter winds strip the last leaves from imported olive trees. Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose wealth flows from the ashes of Spartacus' rebellion and the blood of proscription lists, examines his manicured fingernails while discussing the division of continents. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, conqueror of the East, whose very cognomen proclaims greatness, studies Caesar with the calculating gaze of a general who has never lost a campaign. These three men, bound by mutual advantage rather than friendship, have carved the republic into spheres of influence that the Senate cannot acknowledge and the people cannot prevent. The secret compact they have forged divides the world's riches among conspirators who discover that the Roman constitution offers no defense against coordinated ambition. Pompey will receive Spain and its silver mines through legislation that transforms illegal commands into legal governorships. Crassus will claim Syria and its eastern borders, where Parthian gold awaits liberation through Roman efficiency. Caesar will take Gaul, both Cisalpine and Transalpine, where barbarian tribes possess wealth beyond counting and military reputations ripe for destruction. Each man's prosperity depends on the other's success, creating a triumvirate whose collapse will drag the republic into the abyss. Beyond the Alps, the Celtic world sprawls across territories that dwarf the Mediterranean basin, stretching from the Atlantic shores of Lusitania to the Black Sea steppes, where Gallic mercenaries serve barbarian kings. 300 tribes speaking related tongues but maintaining fierce independence populate lands where Roman merchants venture only with armed escorts and diplomatic immunity purchased through careful bribes. The Helvetii graze their cattle on Swiss meadows, the Belgi forge iron weapons in northern forests, and the Arverni count their wealth in British tin and amber carried down from mysterious Baltic shores. These peoples know Rome as distant thunder, a source of luxury goods and diplomatic marriages, not as existential threat requiring immediate attention. The druids, who bridge Celtic tribes through shared learning, maintain oral traditions that span centuries, teaching young nobles the genealogies of gods and heroes while conducting sacrifices that Roman sensibilities find simultaneously fascinating and abhorrent. Their sacred groves, where human blood waters oak trees older than Rome itself, preserve astronomical knowledge and legal precedents that knit Celtic society together across political boundaries. The druids alone travel freely between tribes, their persons sacred even during warfare, carrying messages and mediating disputes through authority that transcends earthly kingship. They speak of Rome as fire speaks of water, natural enemies whose meeting means destruction for one or transformation for both. Celtic warriors measure honor through cattle raids and single combat, their bronze talks and elaborate weapons proclaiming status earned through personal courage rather than inherited privilege. The warrior culture that defines Celtic nobility celebrates individual heroism over disciplined formations, producing champions whose names echo through bardic songs, but armies that fragment under sustained pressure. Their chariots and longswords represent technological sophistication, adapted to tribal warfare, where battles begin with ritual challenges and end with the taking of heads for display at victory feasts. Against Roman military science, such individual prowess becomes magnificent futility. The oppida that crown Celtic hilltops, fortified towns where craftsmen work gold and iron, while farmers seek protection behind earthen ramparts, represents civilization different from, but parallel to, Mediterranean urbanization. These centers of trade and governance, connected by roads that facilitate commerce and communication across tribal boundaries, demonstrate organizational capacity that Rome consistently underestimates. The wealth concentrated in oppida treasuries, golden talks, imported wine amphorae, British hunting dogs, Spanish silver, testifies to economic networks spanning the continent. Yet their defenses remain medieval, trusting in height and earthworks against siege engines that have reduced Greek cities and Asian fortresses to rubble. Caesar's consulship expires with the new year, leaving him vulnerable to prosecution by enemies who have sharpened their rhetorical knives throughout his term in office. Marcus Porcius Cato, whose stoic principles mask political calculation as sharp as any blade, prepares charges that could see Caesar exiled or executed for the constitutional violations that enabled his legislation. The only escape lies in proconsular command that provides legal immunity while generating the wealth necessary to purchase continued political relevance. Gaul offers both sanctuary and opportunity. 5 years of command in territories where Roman law permits any action that advances Roman interests. The legions that will march north in spring represent military evolutions centuries in the making. Professional soldiers serving 25-year terms, equipped with standardized weapons and trained in tactics that have conquered the known world. Their centurions learned war in Spain and Asia. Their engineers study Greek mathematical texts while designing siege equipment. Their cavalry includes German and Numidian auxiliaries whose skills complement Roman discipline. Against Celtic individualism, these legions represent collective will, focused through institutional memory that spans generations of warfare. The machine that crushed Carthage and humbled Macedonia prepares to process Celtic culture through administrative efficiency. The maps that Caesar studies show territories marked "Here be dragons beyond the Rhine," where Germanic tribes sharpen their iron on Roman skulls, and Persian merchants disappear into forests that swallow entire armies. Gaul represents the stepping stone to greater conquests. Britain's mysterious druids, Germany's limitless forests, perhaps even the northern sea where ice never melts, and the sun traces strange patterns through perpetual twilight. Each successful campaign will demand larger armies, greater risks, more extensive territories to govern and loot. The proconsulship that begins as escape from debt will transform into addiction to power that makes kingship inevitable. The message arrives in Rome as Caesar prepares for his Gallic command, carried by merchants whose urgency suggests opportunity rather than catastrophe. Beyond the Alps, an entire people has set fire to their homeland and begun marching west across territories that Rome considers within its sphere of influence. The Helvetii, Swiss mountain dwellers, whose warriors have earned respect through generations of mercenary service in distant wars, have abandoned their ancestral valleys in favor of migration that will reshape the balance of power throughout Gaul. Their decision, born from population pressure and Germanic threats pressing from across the Rhine, creates the crisis that Caesar needs to justify intervention in affairs that Rome has previously managed through diplomacy and bribes. The scale of the Helvetii migration defies precedent in Celtic memory. Vercingetorix, the nobleman whose vision inspired this mass exodus, convinced his people that their mountain valleys could no longer support increasing numbers, while Germanic pressure from the east made expansion inevitable. The census that tribal leaders conducted before departure recorded 368,000 souls. Men, women, children, and elderly, along with their herds, possessions, and the accumulated wealth of generations spent controlling alpine passes. The logistics of moving such numbers across territories held by potentially hostile tribes required planning that began years before the first wagon rolled westward down mountain paths worn by centuries of seasonal migration. The preparations that preceded departure revealed organization that Roman observers grudgingly acknowledged as sophisticated despite its barbarian origins. The Helvetii systematically burned their oppida, 12 fortified towns that had controlled trade routes and concentrated tribal wealth, along with 400 villages whose smoke columns announced irrevocable commitment to migration or destruction. Granaries that might have sustained besieged populations fed pyres that consumed the physical infrastructure of Swiss Celtic civilization. Only 3 days' provisions travelled with the migrants, forcing them to negotiate passage and sustenance from tribes whose territories they would traverse or conquer. The route that Vercingetorix planned would carry his people through the territory of Rome's Gallic allies, creating legal justification for intervention that Caesar's enemies could not challenge without appearing to abandon Roman commitments. The Sequani had granted passage through their lands in exchange for hostages and tribute, but their territory bordered the Roman province, where Latin-speaking colonists worked vineyards under legionary protection. Any disruption to provincial tranquility would demand proconsular response, transforming migration into invasion, regardless of Helvetii intentions. The legal framework that Rome had constructed to manage barbarian relations made Caesar's intervention not just permissible, but obligatory. The geographical constraints that channeled Helvetii movement played into Roman strategic advantages, while creating vulnerabilities that skilled diplomacy might have avoided. The northern route through Germanic territories remained blocked by Ariovistus and his Suebi, whose recent crossing of the Rhine had destabilized traditional tribal boundaries. The southern passage required Helvetii negotiations with the Allobroges, recently conquered by Rome and governed by magistrates whose loyalty depended on continued Roman support. The only viable path led through the narrow passage between Lake Geneva and the Jura Mountains, where Roman engineering had constructed roads that facilitated legitimate trade, while enabling military interdiction when circumstances required. Caesar's march north with the 13th Legion represented calculated risk disguised as routine administrative travel. The single legion that accompanied him from Rome possessed neither the strength to defeat 368,000 migrants, nor the supplies to sustain extended campaigning in territories beyond established Roman logistics networks. Yet its presence at Geneva transformed diplomatic negotiations into military confrontation, forcing the Helvetii to request formal permission for passage rather than simply proceeding according to agreements already negotiated with local tribes. The legal precedent that Caesar established, Rome's right to regulate movement through territories adjacent to its provinces, would justify decades of subsequent intervention. The Helvetii embassy that met Caesar at Geneva included nobles whose bronze torques and imported weapons displayed wealth accumulated through generations of controlling alpine trade routes. Their request for passage through Roman territory seemed reasonable to tribal sensibilities that viewed movement as natural right, but Caesar's refusal reflected imperial logic that demanded formal submission before considering barbarian needs. The 2 weeks he requested for deliberation allowed time for reinforcements to arrive while forcing the Helvetii to maintain expensive camps that consumed their limited provisions. Delay became siege through administrative efficiency rather than military blockade. The destruction of the bridge at Geneva demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities while creating psychological pressure that accumulated with each passing day. The Helvetii, watching their carefully planned timetable dissolve through bureaucratic obstruction, faced choices that tribal councils found increasingly unacceptable. Return to burned homelands meant starvation and Germanic conquests. Forced passage through Roman positions meant war against legions whose reputation had grown through Spanish and Asian victories. Alternative routes required negotiations with tribes that might demand tribute exceeding Helvetii resources, or refuse passage entirely to maintain Roman friendship. The decision to attempt forced crossing represented desperation masquerading as boldness, tribal independence asserting itself against imperial management that reduced entire peoples to administrative problems requiring military solutions. The rafts and bridges that Helvetii engineers constructed under Roman observation demonstrated technological competence while revealing strategic naivety that underestimated Caesar's willingness to transform defensive positions into offensive opportunities. The crossing attempt that began at dawn found Roman auxiliary cavalry and Germanic mercenaries prepared to exact casualties that would cripple Helvetii military capacity before the main engagement began. The slaughter at the crossing point, where Lake Geneva's cold waters received thousands of Celtic bodies, marked Rome's transition from diplomatic management to military conquest in Gallic affairs. Caesar's account, written for Roman audiences who appreciated decisive action over diplomatic complexity, emphasized barbarian aggression while minimizing the legal sophistication that trapped the Helvetii between impossible alternatives. The 6,000 Helvetii who died attempting to cross represented not military defeat, but administrative efficiency applied to population management through superior firepower. The subsequent pursuit across Gallic territories demonstrated logistical capabilities that tribal warfare could not match. Caesar's legions, supplied through arrangements with pro-Roman Gallic nobles and reinforced by auxiliary units whose loyalty depended on regular pay, maintained pursuit across distances that would have exhausted tribal armies dependent on local foraging. The Helvetii, burdened by civilians and livestock that slowed movement while consuming increasingly scarce resources, found themselves trapped between geographical obstacles and military pressure that accumulated daily. The battle at Bibracte, where the Helvetii made their final stand on the hill fort of their Aedui allies, revealed the tactical superiority that professional armies possessed over tribal levies, regardless of individual Celtic courage. The disciplined cohorts that Caesar deployed in oblique formation systematically destroyed Helvetii resistance through coordinated attacks that exploited weaknesses in tribal battle lines organized around personal loyalty rather than tactical efficiency. The 130,000 survivors who surrendered after watching their warriors die in hopeless charges faced choices between slavery and return to territories they had already burned. Caesar's decision to force the surviving Helvetii back to their devastated homeland established precedents that would govern Roman policy throughout the Gallic Wars. The migration that began as demographic necessity became object lesson in the consequences of challenging Roman authority, even indirectly through geographical proximity that created administrative inconvenience. The burned oppida that the survivors rebuilt with Roman permission remained under Roman supervision, their new construction incorporating defensive features that reflected imperial rather than tribal military architecture. The census that Caesar conducted among the returning Helvetii revealed the demographic catastrophe that Roman intervention had inflicted on Celtic population growth. Of the 368,000 who began the migration, Only 110,000 survive to reoccupy their ancestral valleys under Roman oversight. The reduction reflected not just military casualties, but disease, starvation, and enslavement that accompanied forced population movements across territories where Roman logistics networks determined survival rates. The Swiss valleys that had launched Celtic migration received back a remnant people whose independence existed only through Roman tolerance. The precedent established through Helvetii destruction resonated throughout Gaul as tribal councils calculated the costs of challenging Roman interests. The migration that might have been managed through diplomatic concessions had become demonstration of imperial power that transformed every subsequent tribal decision into question of submission or resistance to Roman authority, expanding beyond its traditional boundaries. The fires that consumed Helvetii announced the beginning of systematic destruction that would reduce Celtic Europe to archaeological memory. The Rhine flows cold and grey through forests that Roman imagination populates with monsters, its current carrying reports of a threat that dwarfs the Helvetii migration in both scale and menace. Beyond the great river's eastern bank, where Celtic civilization yields to Germanic barbarism, King Ariovistus of the Suebi has assembled the largest tribal confederation in northern European memory. His 120,000 warriors, hardened by generations of warfare against Celtic neighbours and trained in combat techniques that make Roman centurions uneasy, have crossed into Gaul with their families and herds, claiming territories by right of conquest that no diplomacy can challenge or reverse. The Sequani, whose fatal miscalculation invited this Germanic avalanche, discovered too late that mercenaries who defeat your enemies rarely depart quietly to their homelands. 15 years earlier, their war against the Aedui for dominance over Gallic trade routes seemed manageable through traditional Celtic warfare, raids, battles, negotiations, and truces that settled nothing permanently, while preserving tribal honor. The decision to hire Germanic warriors across the Rhine appeared inspired, bringing military expertise that could tip the balance while avoiding the obligation that hiring fellow Celts would have created through kinship networks and reciprocal duties. Ariovistus arrived with 15,000 Suebi warriors whose tactical discipline and iron weapons quickly established Germanic military superiority over traditional Celtic fighting methods. The victory that followed at Margitor Briga destroyed Ardui power while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded Sequani expectations and contractual agreements. Instead of accepting payment and returning across the Rhine, Ariovistus demanded territorial concessions that effectively established Germanic sovereignty over 1/3 of Sequani lands. When tribal councils protested this interpretation of mercenary service, additional Germanic settlers appeared to support their king's expanded territorial claims. The demographic transformation that followed Germanic settlement created irreversible changes in Gallic political geography. Suebi families, arriving in organized groups with livestock and agricultural implements, established permanent communities that displaced Celtic populations through systematic intimidation and occasional massacre. The farming techniques that Germanic settlers employed, clearing forests that Celts considered sacred, draining marshlands that provided refuge during raids, demonstrated environmental mastery that complemented military dominance. Within a decade, Germanic languages competed with Celtic dialects in territories that had never previously experienced cultural subordination to trans-Rhenish peoples. The Aedui, Rome's oldest Gallic allies, whose friendship treaties predated Caesar's birth, found their appeals for assistance creating diplomatic complications that threatened imperial stability. Their ambassadors, arriving in Rome with gifts and genealogies proving ancestral loyalty, demanded Roman intervention against Germanic occupation of territories that treaties guaranteed would remain under Celtic control. The legal obligations that these agreements created conflicted with practical realities of Roman power projection across distances that strained military logistics while risking confrontation with peoples whose military capabilities remained unknown quantities. The Germanic Confederation that Ariovistus commanded represented tribal organization on scales that Celtic society could not match through traditional kinship structures. The Suebi alone controlled territories larger than Roman Gaul, their population estimated at 100,000 warriors, drawn from multiple sub-tribes united through military leadership rather than blood relationships. Beyond the Suebi, the Cimbri and Teutones, who had terrorized Italy a generation earlier, maintained alliances with tribes whose names Roman intelligence could not even properly pronounce. The potential for additional Germanic migration created nightmares among Roman strategists who remembered Marius's struggles against previous invasions. The religious practices that bound Germanic tribes together horrified Celtic druids while fascinating Roman anthropologists seeking to understand barbarian motivation through spiritual observation. Germanic warriors dedicated their victories to gods whose altars required human sacrifice on scales that dwarfed Celtic ritual obligations, creating cult practices that transform warfare into religious duty, transcending normal tribal limitations. The groves where Germanic priests conducted sacrifices, decorated with skulls of enemies and hung with weapons taken in battle, established sacred geography that made territorial concessions impossible through normal diplomatic negotiation. Caesar's initial approach to the Germanic problem reflected imperial preference for diplomatic solutions that avoided military risks while achieving political objectives through administrative manipulation. The embassy that he dispatched to Ariovistus carried gifts appropriate for a recognized king, along with proposals for territorial division that might satisfy Germanic ambitions while preserving Roman interests. These negotiations that followed reveal fundamental misunderstandings about authority structures that made meaningful agreement impossible, despite both sides' apparent willingness to avoid immediate warfare. Ariovistus received Roman ambassadors with ceremony that acknowledged imperial dignity while asserting Germanic independence from external authority, regardless of its source. His response to Caesar's proposals demonstrated political sophistication that Roman prejudices about barbarian simplicity had not anticipated. The Germanic king pointed out that his territorial claims rested on conquest that Roman legal tradition recognized as legitimate, while his settlers had established communities that removal would require warfare exceeding anything Romans had previously contemplated. The logic that supported Roman expansion could hardly condemn Germanic settlement, achieved through identical methods. The conference that Caesar arranged between Roman and Germanic leadership near modern Strasbourg created theatrical confrontation that both sides understood would determine whether diplomacy or warfare would resolve their territorial dispute. The protocols that governed such meetings, exchange of hostages, limitations on armed retinues, sacred guarantees against violence, reflected Celtic traditions that Romans had adopted for barbarian negotiations. The failure of these protocols to achieve meaningful agreement revealed cultural differences that made peaceful coexistence impossible, regardless of individual leaders' preferences. The personal meeting between Caesar and Ariovistus, conducted through interpreters whose linguistic limitations complicated every exchange, demonstrated the impossibility of resolving through negotiation conflicts rooted in incompatible worldviews about territorial sovereignty and political authority. Ariovistus, speaking through Germanic nobles, whose bronze weapons and foreign ornaments displayed wealth accumulated through successful warfare, demanded recognition of Germanic rights to territories conquered through methods that Roman history celebrated when Romans employed them. Caesar, representing imperial authority that brooked no challenge to its expansion, regardless of legal precedents that might support barbarian claims, offered compromises that preserved faith while demanding submission. The breakdown of negotiations, precipitated by Ariovistus's refusal to withdraw from territories that Germanic settlement had transformed into homelands rather than temporary occupation, created military necessity that Roman political logic made inevitable. The Germanic king's final words to Caesar's embassy, that Rome might rule south of the Alps but had no authority in Germanic affairs, established philosophical positions that warfare alone could resolve. The diplomacy that might have managed tribal conflicts became impossible when confronted with organized peoples whose political sophistication matched their military capabilities. The Roman panic that followed diplomatic failure reflected accurate assessment of military challenges that Germanic warfare presented to legionary tactics developed for Mediterranean conditions. Intelligence reports describing Germanic military organization, warrior culture, and tactical innovations created anxiety among centurions whose experience fighting Celtic individualists provided poor preparation for confronting disciplined tribal armies. The prospect of campaigning beyond established supply lines against enemies whose capabilities exceeded reliable intelligence estimates in territories where Roman logistics advantages disappeared into hostile geography concentrated military minds on problems that normal Roman confidence could not resolve. The decision to advance against Ariovistus, despite Germanic military advantages, reflected Caesar's understanding that retreat would destroy Roman prestige throughout Gaul, while encouraging additional Germanic migration that future proconsuls would find impossible to contain. The legions that marched east toward the Rhine carried not just Roman standards but imperial credibility that failure would shatter across barbarian Europe. The war that followed would determine whether Rhine remained geographic boundary or became Germanic highway into the heart of Celtic Gaul, where Roman commercial interests and political alliances had created informal empire that Germanic success would eliminate forever. The northern winds that sweep down from the Channel coasts carry more than autumn's chill as Caesar's legions cross into the lands of the Belgae, where tribal confederations maintain military traditions that make southern Gallic warriors appear soft by comparison. The message that preceded the Roman advance, demands for submission wrapped in diplomatic courtesy, has united peoples who normally wage war against each other with the fury of blood feuds spanning generations. From the forests of the Ardennes to the coastal marshes where Germanic settlers mix with Celtic natives, war chiefs gather their finest warriors for a confrontation that will determine whether Rome's northern expansion ends at Belgian spears or Belgian funeral pyres. The Belgae, who prepare to resist Roman encroachment, represent Celtic military culture refined through constant warfare against Germanic pressure from across the Rhine and maritime rage from British tribes seeking continental plunder. Their warriors, trained from childhood in weaponscraft that emphasizes individual prowess within disciplined formations, have developed tactical innovations that combine Celtic courage with Germanic organization. The confederation that assembles against Caesar includes 60,000 seasoned fighters whose bronze torques and pattern-welded swords testify to wealth accumulated through successful raids and tribute extracted from weaker neighbors throughout northern Gaul. King Ambiorix of the Eburones, whose name will echo through Roman nightmares for generations, addresses the war council that meets in sacred groves, where druids conduct rituals designed to bind tribal loyalties through supernatural sanction. The Belgian leader, his battlefield scars mapping conflicts that span 2 decades of frontier warfare, speaks truths that resonate through assembled nobles, whose own territories face Roman administrative absorption should Caesar's campaign succeed. The choice before the Confederation transcends immediate military concerns to embrace existential questions about Celtic survival in a world where Roman civilization advances through systematic destruction of alternative cultural possibilities. The intelligence that reaches Caesar through Gallic informants describes Belgian military preparations with growing unease as the scope of tribal coordination becomes apparent. Unlike previous campaigns, where Celtic individualism prevented sustained cooperation between rival peoples, the Belgian Confederation has achieved unity through shared recognition that Roman expansion threatens all equally, regardless of previous enmities. The logistics that support 60,000 warriors operating in coordinated fashion across multiple tribal territories demonstrate organizational capabilities that Roman prejudices about barbarian chaos have consistently underestimated. The Nervii, acknowledged even by their Celtic neighbours as the fiercest warriors in northern Gaul, occupy territories along the Sabis River, where dense forests provide defensive advantages that nullify Roman engineering superiority. The warriors who emerge from Nervii forests fight with iron discipline, matched to berserker fury, their tactics adapted to terrain that favours ambush over formal battle, where Roman formations might demonstrate technological superiority. Caesar's advance into Belgian territory proceeds with cautious confidence that masks growing anxiety about intelligence failures that leave Roman forces operating in hostile territory without reliable information about enemy dispositions or intentions. The local guides, whose loyalty depends on Roman victory, provide information filtered through fear and self-interest, creating tactical blindness that forces Roman columns to advance through landscapes where every hill might conceal Belgian warriors, and every forest could hide coordinated attacks. The logistical challenges of maintaining supply lines across territories where no pro-Roman settlements exist compound military difficulties with administrative complexities. The Sargis River appears to offer a suitable crossing point where Roman engineering capabilities can overcome geographical obstacles, while Belgian resistance might be contained through superior tactics and equipment. The scouts who survey potential crossing sites report minimal opposition along banks that seem to invite Roman passage, their observations creating tactical confidence that blinds commanders to the sophisticated trap that Belgian planning has prepared. The decision to establish camp on the river's southern bank while preparing for crossing reflects Roman operational doctrine adapted to Mediterranean conditions rather than northern European realities. The morning that brings disaster dawns clear and cold, with mists rising from the Sabis waters as Roman engineers begin constructing the pontoon bridges that will carry legions into Belgian territory. The 7th and 12th legions, Caesar's most experienced formations, take positions securing the crossing while engineers work under auxiliary protection. The 8th, 9th, 10th and 11th legions begin establishing marching camp according to standard procedures that have proved effective in dozens of previous campaigns. The methodical efficiency that characterizes Roman military organization proceeds without awareness that Belgian eyes observe every movement from concealed positions across the river. The Nervii attack erupts from forest concealment with timing that exploits Roman vulnerability during the transition from march to combat formation. Thousands of warriors emerge simultaneously from woods that appeared empty moments before, their war cries echoing across water as they charge toward Roman positions with speed that leaves no time for defensive preparation. The Belgian assault falls primarily on the 9th and 10th legions, whose soldiers drop construction tools to grab weapons while centurions attempt to form battle lines from work details scattered across the hillside. The tactical situation that develops within minutes threatens to become the greatest Roman military disaster since the Cimbri and Cutanese destroyed entire armies a generation earlier. The Belgian charge, delivered by warriors whose bronze shields and longswords represent martial excellence, refined through decades of frontier warfare, breaks through hastily formed Roman lines, while momentum carries attackers deep into legionary positions. The centuries that manage to achieve formation find themselves isolated by Belgian penetration that splits Roman forces into fragments unable to support each other through coordinated action. Caesar's personal intervention in the developing catastrophe demonstrates leadership that transforms potential rout into desperate rally. The proconsul, abandoning his command position to grab shield and sword from a fallen legionary, advances into the melee, where his purple cloak and general's crest make him target for every Belgian warrior seeking glory through single combat. His presence among the fighting ranks, where aristocratic Romans normally avoid personal danger, provides psychological catalyst that enables surviving centurions to reorganize their shattered units through example of shared peril. The fighting that follows tests Roman military professionalism against Belgian martial fury in combat that strips away tactical sophistication to reveal fundamental questions about individual courage and collective discipline. The Belgian warriors, fighting for homeland and freedom with weapons blessed by druids and courage strengthened by sacred oaths, demonstrate prowess that forces grudging Roman respect, even as legion training gradually reasserts tactical superiority. The hand-to-hand combat that rages across the hillside eliminates technological advantages that normally determine battlefield outcomes, reducing conflict to primal struggle between opposing military cultures. The arrival of the 7th and 12th legions, from their positions securing the river crossing, provides reinforcement that tips tactical balance towards Roman recovery, while demonstrating the disciplinary advantages that professional armies possess over tribal levies, regardless of individual warrior quality. The Belgian attack, brilliantly conceived and courageously executed, lacks tactical reserves necessary to exploit initial success when Roman resistance stiffens through superior organization. The warriors who penetrate deepest into Roman positions find themselves isolated by legionary counterattacks that systematically restore formation integrity through practiced maneuvers. The slaughter that concludes the battle reflects Roman determination to inflict punishment that will discourage future Belgian resistance, while demonstrating consequences of challenging legionary prowess, despite initial tactical advantages. The pursuit that follows Belgian retreat claims thousands of warriors whose deaths represent irreplaceable loss to tribal military capability, their bronze weapons and personal ornaments stripped by Roman soldiers, whose survival depended on professional competence rather than individual heroism. The Belgian Confederation that assembled with such confidence fragments as survivors flee toward territories where Roman vengeance cannot immediately follow. The cost that Rome paid for victory at the Sarges reveals how closely Caesar's expansion came to catastrophic failure that would have ended Gallic operations while encouraging tribal resistance throughout northern Europe. The casualties that Roman units suffered, particularly the 9th and 10th legions, whose effective strength dropped by 60% during the battle, required months of recovery that delayed further operations while reinforcements arrived from Italian recruiting grounds. The near disaster that Belgian courage and tactical skill created established patterns of Celtic resistance that would culminate in coordinated rebellion spanning all Gaul. The psychological impact of the Sarges battle resonated beyond immediate military consequences to influence Roman attitudes toward Celtic military capabilities and the risks inherent in northern expansion. The warriors, who nearly destroyed 2 veteran legions, had demonstrated that Roman tactical superiority could be neutralized through proper terrain selection and coordinated assault, lessons that other Celtic peoples absorbed while preparing their own resistance to imperial encroachment. The Belgian campaign, that began with confident expectations of easy victory, had revealed the true costs of conquering peoples whose martial traditions matched Roman professionalism with indigenous knowledge of local conditions and superior motivation defending ancestral territories. The Atlantic waves crash against Brittany's granite cliffs with primordial fury, their salt spray carrying whispers of mysteries that lie beyond the horizon, where Britain's chalk shores gleam white through channel mists. Here, where Celtic civilization meets the endless ocean, the Veneti have built a maritime empire that challenges Roman assumptions about barbarian capabilities and naval warfare. Their ships, constructed with techniques passed down through generations of Atlantic seafaring, ride swells that would shatter Mediterranean galleys, while carrying warriors whose knowledge of tides and currents makes them masters of waters that Roman admirals fear to navigate. The rebellion that ignites along Ambiorix's coastline springs from Roman administrative arrogance that fails to comprehend the unique relationship between Celtic maritime peoples and their oceanic environment. Caesar's demand for grain supplies and hostages, reasonable by continental standards, strikes Veneti sensibilities as landlubber ignorance of realities that govern coastal survival. The tides that control access to Venetian harbours, the storms that can destroy entire fleets, and the navigational knowledge required for Atlantic sailing represent cultural capital that cannot be surrendered to foreign administrators who measure wealth in agricultural surplus rather than maritime expertise. The Venetian ships that emerge from hidden anchorages to challenge Roman authority represent naval architecture evolved for conditions that Mediterranean experience cannot comprehend. Built from oak timbers thick enough to withstand Atlantic storms, their high sides and deep keels enable navigation in seas where Roman galleys would founder in ordinary weather. The leather sails that power these vessels through crosswinds, and the iron chains that serve as rigging, demonstrate technological adaptation to maritime warfare, where ramming tactics become impossible, and victory depends on seamanship rather than military engineering. Caesar's initial response to Venetian defiance reveals the limitations that continental success creates when confronted with unfamiliar military challenges requiring capabilities that legionary training has never addressed. The fleet that Roman engineers attempt to construct on the Loire represents improvisation by forces whose understanding of naval warfare derives from river operations and lake crossings rather than ocean campaigns, where tide and weather determine tactical possibilities. The galleys that emerge from Roman shipyards carry Mediterranean assumptions, but naval combat into Atlantic conditions that make such vessels death traps for their crews. The druids, whose influence extends from Ireland's sacred islands to the forests of Gaul, find in Veneti resistance and opportunity to coordinate Celtic opposition through religious networks that transcend tribal boundaries. The priests who travel freely between Celtic peoples, their persons protected by supernatural sanctions that even enemies respect, carry messages that transform local rebellion into coordinated resistance spanning territories from Iberia to the Rhine. The human sacrifices that consecrate this alliance, conducted in groves where oak trees older than Rome itself shelter altars stained with centuries of blood, invoke divine support for warfare that transcends normal political calculation. The sacred island of Mona, where Anglesey's druids maintain the most ancient learning of the Celtic world, becomes focal point for resistance that combines military coordination with religious obligation. The priests who gather in Mona's oak groves possess knowledge that spans generations of oral tradition, their memories preserving genealogies of gods and heroes, while their astronomical observations track celestial cycles that determine agricultural and military timing. The rituals that these druids perform, requiring human sacrifice on scales that horrify Roman sensibilities, while binding Celtic peoples through shared spiritual obligation, transform resistance into holy war whose stakes transcend immediate political concerns. The mysteries that surround British participation in continental affairs create psychological pressure that affects Roman decision-making as much as military intelligence influences tactical planning. The island that lies beyond the Channel's treacherous waters remains largely unknown to Mediterranean civilization, its inhabitants described through contradictory reports that emphasize druidical power, warrior prowess, and wealth derived from tin mining in territories where the sun's path traces patterns unknown to southern skies. The prospect of crossing into such unknown lands where geographical ignorance compounds military risks with supernatural uncertainties tests Roman courage in ways that straightforward continental warfare cannot approach. The Veneti naval tactics that emerged during the campaign's first encounters demonstrate maritime expertise that nullifies Roman advantages while exploiting weaknesses that continental experience has never addressed. The high-sided ships that ride Atlantic swells beyond Roman reach launch missiles from positions where retaliation becomes impossible, while their knowledge of tidal patterns enables retreats into shallow waters where pursuing galleys run aground. The bronze weaponry and seamanship skills that Celtic marines display during boarding actions prove that maritime warfare requires different qualities than land combat, where Roman discipline provides decisive advantages. Caesar's decision to construct a fleet capable of challenging Veneti naval supremacy represents logistical undertaking that strains Roman administrative capabilities while demonstrating imperial determination to overcome any obstacle that geographic conditions present. The forests that fall to provide timber for Roman shipbuilding, the metal workers who forge naval equipment according to specifications that Roman engineers adapt from captured Celtic vessels, and the recruitment of auxiliary sailors from Mediterranean communities represent resource mobilization that dwarfs previous provincial operations. The investment that Rome commits to Armoricaine warfare reflects political necessity rather than economic calculation. The technical innovations that Roman engineering develops to counter Venetian advantages demonstrate adaptability that enables imperial expansion into environments where traditional methods prove inadequate. The hooks and cutting tools that Roman engineers designed to attack Venetian rigging systems, the modifications that transform Mediterranean galleys into vessels capable of limited Atlantic operations, and the tactical adaptations that enable land-based artillery to engage maritime targets represent creative responses to military challenges that standard doctrine cannot address. The learning curve that these innovations require costs Roman lives, while teaching lessons that future naval operations will incorporate. The psychological warfare that accompanies naval operations reflects deep-seated Roman anxieties about oceanic environments that their Mediterranean experience has not prepared them to understand or master. The fog that shrouds channel waters during crucial operations, the tides that strand Roman vessels in positions where Veneti attack becomes inevitable, and the storms that scatter fleets despite careful meteorological observation create conditions where supernatural explanation seems more plausible than natural causation. The druids whose curses accompany Celtic resistance exploit these fears through rituals designed to invoke divine intervention in maritime warfare. The human sacrifices that Venetian druids conduct to ensure divine support for their naval operations horrify Roman observers while demonstrating religious commitment that transforms military resistance into spiritual obligation. The warriors whose bodies hang in oak groves, their blood feeding trees that shelter altars where priests conduct ceremonies requiring specialized knowledge of seasonal timing and astronomical observation, represent offerings that Celtic theology considers necessary for maintaining cosmic balance. The Roman reaction to such practices, combining fascination with revulsion, reveals cultural differences that make meaningful accommodation impossible between civilizations whose fundamental assumptions about divine-human relationships diverge completely. The intelligence that reaches Caesar about British involvement in Venetian resistance creates strategic complications that extend beyond immediate military concerns to embrace questions about imperial expansion into territories where Roman knowledge fails completely. The reports of British druids coordinating continental resistance, British warriors serving in Venetian fleets, and British resource sources supporting Armorican operations suggest connections that challenge Roman assumptions about tribal independence, while implying organized opposition spanning oceanic distances. The prospect that Celtic resistance might receive support from territories beyond Roman reach creates nightmares among strategic planners whose continental experience provides no guidance for maritime campaigns. The first channel crossing that Roman intelligence operatives attempt, conducted in vessels whose construction reflects desperate improvisation rather than systematic naval development, demonstrates both imperial determination and technological inadequacy that characterizes early British operations. The reconnaissance that these missions provide, gathered through observation of coastal defences and limited contact with British tribes, reveals military capabilities that match continental Celtic standards, while suggesting population densities that dwarf Gallic tribal concentration. The geographical intelligence that emerges from such dangerous missions, detailing tidal patterns and coastal topography that future operations will require, comes at costs that reflect the price of expanding into unknown territories. The religious dimension that British resistance adds to continental warfare, channeled through druidical networks that operate beyond Roman administrative reach, transforms local rebellions into coordinated campaigns whose spiritual significance transcends immediate political objectives. The sacred sites that British Druids maintain, hidden in forests where human sacrifice continues according to traditions that predate Roman historical memory, represent centers of resistance that military force alone cannot eliminate. The power that these priests wield over Celtic imagination, their ability to coordinate resistance through religious obligation rather than political alliance, creates challenges that Roman institutional experience has never encountered in Mediterranean contexts. The decision to launch expeditionary operations against Britain represents Caesar's recognition that Venetian resistance cannot be definitively crushed, while British support continues to sustain Armorican operations through resources and expertise that Roman naval capabilities cannot interdict. The preparations that such operations require, involving fleet construction on unprecedented scales and recruitment of personnel whose skills must be developed through dangerous experimentation, demonstrate imperial commitment to expansion, regardless of costs or risks that prudent calculation might counsel avoiding. The channel waters that claimed Roman lives during the previous year's reconnaissance gleam, deceptively calm in the summer dawn of 54 BC, their surface betraying nothing of the currents and storms that make these narrows more treacherous than any Mediterranean passage. Yet Caesar's second invasion fleet, assembled through winter preparations that stripped Gallic forests of suitable timber, represents naval power on scales that dwarf the previous year's experimental crossing. 800 vessels crowd the harbours of northern Gaul, their holds packed with 25,000 legionaries and 2,000 cavalry, whose armour glints in morning light while British scouts across the water count Roman preparations with growing alarm. The logistics that support this massive undertaking demonstrate imperial determination to complete what reconnaissance had begun, regardless of costs that strain provincial resources beyond normal administrative limits. The shipwrights who laboured through Gallic winter, adapting Mediterranean designs to channel conditions while incorporating lessons learned through previous disasters, have created hybrid vessels whose shallow drafts enable beach landings while their reinforced construction survives Atlantic storms. The cavalry transports, specially designed to carry horses across waters where panic can transform military assets into deadly cargo, represent engineering innovations that Roman naval tradition has never previously required. The British preparations that await this Roman armada reflect tribal coordination achieved through druidical networks that have transformed individual kingdoms into confederated resistance spanning territories from the Channel shores to the Pennine highlands. Cassivellaunus, whose name the Romans struggled to pronounce correctly, has emerged as war leader through political maneuvering that transcends traditional tribal boundaries, while demonstrating strategic vision that Roman intelligence has consistently underestimated. The warriors who gather under his command represent British martial traditions refined through generations of intertribal warfare and continental military service that provides tactical knowledge of Roman methods. The landing that follows demonstrates both Roman military efficiency and British tactical adaptation to invasion that previous years' experience has taught them to anticipate. The beaches that offered easy access during the first crossing now bristle with defensive preparations, sharpened stakes driven into sand, cavalry positioned for immediate counterattack, and chariots whose mobility enables rapid concentration against Roman beachheads. The British resistance that greets Roman disembarkation reflects coordinated planning rather than spontaneous tribal response. Their attacks timed to exploit Roman vulnerability during the transition from naval to land operations. The chariot warfare that British nobles employ against Roman formations represents military technology that Mediterranean experience has rendered obsolete, but channel geography makes tactically viable. The two-wheeled vehicles that career across British downs, carrying warriors whose bronze shields and long swords proclaim aristocratic status, demonstrate mobility that enables rapid engagement and withdrawal across terrain where Roman infantry formations become unwieldy. The psychological impact of chariot charges, combining the thunder of wheels with war cries of warriors whose personal courage matches their tactical skill, tests Roman discipline in ways that continental Celtic resistance has never achieved. Cassivellaunus himself embodies British resistance through personal qualities that Roman accounts acknowledge, despite their author's cultural prejudices about barbarian leadership capabilities. The British war leader, whose political acumen has united traditionally hostile tribes through recognition of shared threats, demonstrates strategic thinking that adapts traditional Celtic warfare to Roman tactical innovations, while exploiting geographical advantages that island conditions provide. The guerrilla campaign that he orchestrates, avoiding pitched battles where Roman discipline might prove decisive while maintaining constant pressure through raids and ambushes, reveals military sophistication that challenges Roman assumptions about barbarian strategic limitations. The Thames crossing that Caesar forces represents both tactical necessity and symbolic demonstration of Roman power over British geographical obstacles that previous invaders have found insurmountable. The stakes that British engineers have driven into the riverbed, their iron points designed to impale Roman cavalry while creating obstacles that infantry formations cannot easily overcome, reflect defensive preparations that exploit local knowledge while incorporating lessons learned from continental warfare. The river battle that follows tests Roman engineering capabilities against British tactical innovation in an aquatic environment where traditional advantages disappear beneath flowing waters. The tribal politics that complicate British resistance reveals social complexities that Roman administrative experience struggles to comprehend or exploit effectively. The kingdoms that acknowledge Cassivellaunus as war leadership maintain internal autonomies that prevent unified command while creating opportunities for Roman diplomatic manipulation through selective negotiations with individual rulers. The hostages and tribute that some tribes offer represent attempts to preserve local independence through accommodation with Roman power, their calculations reflecting pragmatic assessment of military realities rather than genuine submission to imperial authority. The fortifications that protect British oppida demonstrate defensive architecture adapted to local conditions while incorporating continental innovations that British warriors have observed during service in Gallic armies. The earthworks that crown British hilltops, their timber-laced ramparts and complex entrance systems designed to channel attackers into killing zones, represent engineering sophistication that challenges Roman siege techniques developed for Mediterranean stone fortifications. The tribal centers that these defenses protect, concentrating wealth and administrative functions while providing refuge during military campaigns, embody British social organization that combines Celtic traditions with insular adaptation. The wealth that Roman forces discover during successful assaults on British settlements reveals economic networks that span oceanic distances while generating resources that dwarf Gallic tribal treasures. The gold talks and elaborate weaponry that adorn British nobles, the iron currency bars that facilitate internal trade, and the imported goods that demonstrate continental connections reflect prosperity derived from mineral extraction and maritime commerce. The tin that British mines produce, essential for bronze working throughout the ancient world, represents a strategic resource that Roman control would monopolize while denying competitors access to metallurgical necessities. The religious practices that British druids maintain in sacred groves scattered across the island's interior demonstrate spiritual traditions that combine Celtic orthodoxy with insular innovations developed through centuries of isolation from continental influences. The human sacrifices that consecrate British resistance, conducted according to seasonal timing that reflects astronomical knowledge preserved through oral tradition, invoke divine support for warfare while binding tribal loyalties through shared spiritual obligation. The sacred sites where these rituals occur, hidden in forests whose oak trees shelter altars stained with centuries of blood, represent centers of resistance that military force alone cannot eliminate. The intelligence that Roman reconnaissance gathers about British population densities and tribal territories reveals demographic resources that exceed previous estimates, while suggesting military potential that successful conquest would add to imperial capabilities. The warrior traditions that British tribes maintain, their training methods that emphasize individual prowess within coordinated formations, and their weapons technology that matches continental standards, demonstrate martial capabilities that Roman recruitment could harness for future campaigns. The prospect of incorporating British manpower into imperial armies, their island origins providing natural protection against desertion, while their Celtic culture offers compatibility with Gallic auxiliary units, create strategic possibilities that extend beyond immediate conquest objectives. The seasonal limitations that British weather imposes on military operations force Roman acceptance of campaigning schedules that Mediterranean experience has never required commanders to consider. The fogs that shroud British coasts during crucial periods, the rains that transform roads into impassable quagmires, and the early darkness that shortens operational days reflect climatic conditions where tactical planning must accommodate natural rhythms rather than impose imperial timetables. The logistics that such conditions require, provisioning armies through winter months when local resources disappear beneath snow and ice, strain Roman administrative capabilities while demonstrating costs of northern expansion. The decision to withdraw before winter storms make channel crossing impossible represents strategic calculation rather than military defeat, though British propaganda will claim victory regardless of Roman tactical achievements. The hostages that accompany Roman evacuation, including nobles whose families guarantee tribal compliance with negotiated agreements, provide diplomatic leverage while demonstrating successful penetration of British political networks. The tribute arrangements that Caesar establishes, requiring annual payments that acknowledge Roman suzerainty without imposing direct administrative control, create legal frameworks for future intervention while generating resources that partially offset campaign costs. The crossing that returns Roman forces to Gallic shores carries mixed results that defy simple evaluation as victory or defeat in traditional military terms. The intelligence that two campaigns have gathered about British capabilities, geography, and political organization provides strategic knowledge that future operations will require for permanent conquest. Yet the resistance that British Confederation mounted, their tactical innovations that neutralized Roman advantages while inflicting casualties that veteran legions could ill afford, demonstrates costs that imperial expansion into oceanic territories will exact from commanders and soldiers whose experience derives from continental warfare. The British freedom that survives Roman departure carries implications that extend beyond immediate military concerns to embrace questions about imperial limitations when confronted with peoples whose geographical advantages match their martial capabilities. The island that remains unconquered beyond Channel waters represents challenge to Roman prestige, while providing sanctuary for druidical resistance that continues to coordinate continental opposition through religious networks spanning tribal boundaries. The unfinished business that Britain represents will haunt Roman strategic planning until another generation completes what Caesar's campaigns began but could not definitively conclude. The winter of 54 BC settles over Gaul like a shroud, its early snows concealing preparations that will transform sporadic tribal resistance into coordinated rebellion spanning territories from the Rhine to the Atlantic. In scattered camps across conquered lands, Roman legions settle into wooden fortresses whose walls seem secure against barbarian assault but cannot protect against the subtler dangers of isolation and complacency. The decision to disperse forces across multiple winter quarters, driven by logistical necessity and political calculation, creates vulnerabilities that Celtic intelligence networks have been mapping with patient precision throughout the campaigning season. Ambiorix of the Eburones moves through the Ardennes forests like a predator who has studied his prey's habits until every weakness becomes visible. The Belgian king, whose people suffered under Roman administrative demands while watching their Germanic neighbors probe for signs of imperial weakness, has spent months coordinating with tribal leaders whose grudges against Roman rule transcend traditional enmities. The network of communication that connects Celtic nobles from the Channel shores to the Rhine frontier, maintained through druidical channels and kinship ties that Roman divide-and-roll policies have failed to sever, enables planning on scales that tribal warfare has never previously achieved. The camp that contains the 14th and 15th legions, under Sabinus and Cotto, occupies ground that Roman engineers selected for defensive advantages without considering how those same features might become tactical disadvantages when siege conditions change the operational environment. The valley position that provides shelter from winter winds also creates a bowl where attackers can control the surrounding heights, while the proximity to forests that supply construction timber also offers concealment for hostile forces whose movements remain invisible until the moment of attack. The 15,000 Roman soldiers who man these defenses represent veteran formations whose experience fighting Celtic individualists has not prepared them for coordinated assaults by tribal confederations employing sophisticated siege techniques. The deception that Ambiorix employs to draw Roman forces from their defensive positions demonstrates psychological understanding of Roman command culture and the personal rivalries that complicate military decision-making at senior levels. His message to the Roman commanders, delivered through intermediaries whose apparent sincerity marks careful calculation, warns of Germanic invasion across the Rhine, while offering safe passage to other Roman camps if evacuation begins immediately. The intelligence that accompanies this warning, describing Swaby movements that Roman scouts cannot verify independently, exploits Roman fears about trans-Rhenish threats while creating time pressure that prevents careful deliberation about tactical alternatives. Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, whose caution reflects hard-won experience of Celtic duplicity, advocates remaining within defensive positions whose strength has deterred previous tribal attacks, while awaiting confirmation of reported Germanic movements through independent intelligence sources. His arguments, grounded in standard Roman doctrine about winter quarters and the tactical advantages that fortification provides against barbarian assault, represent military orthodoxy that previous campaigns have validated through successful defense of similar positions. The strategic patience that such an approach requires conflict with personal considerations that complicate purely military calculation of optimal response to reported threats. Quintus Titurius Sabinus, whose ambition exceeds his tactical judgment, sees opportunity for independent action that might advance his political career through dramatic success achieved without direct supervision from superior commanders. The Germanic threat that Ambiorix describes, whether genuine or fabricated, creates legal justification for evacuation that standing orders appear to authorize, while personal initiative in managing such crisis could demonstrate leadership qualities that future advancement requires. The decision to abandon defensive positions in favor of movement toward other Roman camps represents compromise between conflicting assessments that satisfies neither strategic caution nor tactical boldness. The evacuation that follows reveals how thoroughly Celtic intelligence has penetrated Roman operational security, their knowledge of legion movements and defensive preparations suggesting information sources that compromise Roman command decisions, almost as they are made. The route that Roman forces select for their withdrawal, chosen for its apparent safety and directness toward the nearest friendly camp, leads through terrain that Ambiorix has prepared with the care of a hunter setting snares for dangerous prey. The baggage train that accompanies the legion, loaded with winter supplies and personal possessions that Roman soldiers cannot abandon, creates logistical constraints that limit tactical flexibility while providing tempting targets for Celtic attack. The ambush that destroys two veteran legions unfolds with precision that demonstrates Celtic tactical sophistication while exploiting Roman vulnerabilities that overconfidence has created through underestimation of barbarian military capabilities. The narrow valley where Ambiorix concentrates his attack channels, Roman movement while preventing deployment of formations that might utilize superior discipline and equipment to overcome numerical disadvantage. The coordinated assault that falls upon Roman columns from multiple directions simultaneously reflects planning that anticipates Roman tactical responses, while preparing countermeasures that neutralize standard legionary advantages. The slaughter that follows shatters Roman assumptions about Celtic military limitations, while demonstrating costs of strategic dispersion when facing coordinated enemies whose intelligence capabilities match their martial prowess. The veteran centurions whose experience spanned decades of successful campaigning die beside raw recruits whose training could not prepare them for warfare, where traditional advantages disappear beneath overwhelming assault. The eagles that fall into Celtic hands represent more than military defeat. They embody imperial prestige whose loss resonates throughout Gaul as proof that Roman invincibility exists only in propaganda rather than battlefield reality. Sabinus and Cotta die, fighting with courage that earns Celtic respect, while their tactical failures create military disaster whose consequences extend far beyond immediate casualties. To embrace strategic implications that threaten Roman control throughout Gaul. The 15,000 soldiers whose bodies fertilize Ardennes soil represent irreplaceable loss of veteran manpower, whose replacement requires time that accelerating rebellion will not permit. The military equipment that falls into Celtic hands, including siege engines and engineering tools that Roman armies depend upon for tactical advantages, provides technical knowledge that future tribal resistance will employ against remaining Roman positions. The news that spreads throughout Gaul with the speed of wildfire transforms isolated tribal grievances into coordinated uprising as communities that have endured Roman administrative demands recognize opportunity for successful resistance. The druids, whose sacred groves have sheltered planning for coordinated rebellion, see divine favor in Germanic victory that validates supernatural support for Celtic independence. The young warriors whose fathers counseled patience with Roman rule abandon such restraint in favor of action that promises glory through participation in historical revenge against foreign oppression. Quintus Tullius Cicero, commanding the 7th Legion in winter quarters that suddenly become besieged fortress, faces siege conditions that test Roman defensive capabilities against Celtic assault techniques that combine traditional valor with technical innovations learned through observation of Roman methods. The brother of Rome's greatest orator discovers that rhetorical skill provides poor preparation for military command when survival depends on tactical decisions rather than persuasive eloquence. The fortifications that seemed adequate for winter protection against routine tribal harassment prove barely sufficient against coordinated siege that employs sophisticated techniques adapted from Roman engineering practices. The siege works that Celtic engineers construct around Cicero's camp demonstrate technical knowledge that challenges Roman assumptions about barbarian technological limitations while revealing how effectively tribal peoples have absorbed lessons from previous exposure to imperial military science. The earthworks that encircle Roman positions, their design incorporating principles of circumvallation that Roman armies have employed against hostile cities, reflect learning that transforms Celtic warfare from spontaneous assault into systematic siegecraft. The artillery that Celtic forces deploy, including torsion engines constructed according to Roman specifications, represents technological transfer that eliminates traditional advantages while creating tactical parity that reduces conflict to questions of endurance and supply. The psychological warfare that accompanies the physical siege employs techniques designed to exploit Roman fears about barbarian savagery while demonstrating Celtic understanding of enemy morale factors that conventional assault cannot address. The heads of Sabinius's soldiers, displayed on stakes where Roman defenders cannot avoid seeing them, provide graphic evidence of fate waiting unsuccessful resistance, while the captured standards that flutter above Celtic positions mock imperial symbols whose power depends on aura of invincibility. The propaganda that Celtic speakers deliver during negotiation attempts combines threats with promises designed to encourage desertion while fragmenting Roman unit cohesion through appeals to individual survival instincts. The relief column that Caesar leads through winter storms to lift Cicero's siege represents personal leadership that transforms potential catastrophe into demonstration of Roman determination to maintain Gallic conquests regardless of seasonal difficulties or tactical disadvantages. The forced marches that carry legions across frozen territories, where normal campaigning becomes impossible, demonstrate logistical capabilities that Celtic planning has not anticipated, while revealing imperial commitment that exceeds tribal expectations about Roman willingness to sustain casualties for strategic objectives. The battle that follows Caesar's arrival, where Roman discipline overcomes Celtic enthusiasm through superior coordination and tactical innovation, provides temporary victory that fails to address underlying causes of rebellion that winter's events have revealed. The strategic implications that emerge from winter's campaigns transcend immediate military results to embrace fundamental questions about Roman capability to maintain control over territories whose populations have demonstrated both willingness and ability to coordinate effective resistance. The tribal networks that enabled simultaneous attacks on multiple Roman positions reveal organizational capabilities that administrative methods have failed to disrupt, while suggesting future resistance potential that military force alone cannot permanently suppress. The the rebellion that ignites in Gaul's winter forests will require more than tactical victories to extinguish, demanding political solutions that recognize Celtic grievances while maintaining imperial authority through accommodation rather than pure coercion. From the volcanic highlands of the Auvergne, where ancient gods still receive blood sacrifice in sacred springs that bubble from Earth's molten depths, emerges the leader that Celtic prophecy has long promised, a king whose name will echo through history as Rome's most dangerous Gallic adversary. Vercingetorix of the Arverni, son of Celtillus, who died for dreaming of unified Gaul, stands before the assembled nobles of central Gaul with charisma that transcends tribal boundaries and vision that transforms local grievances into national liberation. The young chieftain, whose bronze torques and pattern-welded sword proclaim aristocratic lineage, speaks truths that resonate through hearts grown weary of Roman administrative efficiency and souls that remember when Celtic warriors feared no enemy beneath the sky. The strategic genius that Vercingetorix demonstrates from his first assumption of war leadership reflects military education that combines traditional Celtic warrior training with careful study of Roman methods observed through years of client-king collaboration. His analysis of previous tribal failures against Roman expansion identifies fatal weaknesses in Celtic approaches to warfare: the individualism that prevents sustained cooperation, the preference for glorious defeat over practical victory, and the failure to exploit geographical advantages that island and mountain terrain provide against Mediterranean military science. The revolution that he proposes transcends tactical innovation to embrace fundamental transformation of Celtic warfare from heroic gesture into systematic resistance. The confederation that rallies to Vercingetorix's standard represents unprecedented unity among peoples whose traditional enmities have provided Rome with divide and rule opportunities throughout the conquest period. The Aedui, longtime Roman allies whose loyalty has wavered since Germanic pressure demonstrated imperial limitations, abandon client status in favor of independence that promises restoration of traditional prestige. The Squani, whose Germanic miscalculation created Ariovistus crisis, seek redemption through resistance that might restore territorial integrity. From the Atlantic shores, where Venetian maritime culture persists despite naval defeat, to the Rhine frontier, where Germanic pressure creates common cause against Roman expansion, tribal representatives gather in sacred groves, where druids consecrate oaths that bind diverse peoples through shared commitment to Celtic liberation. The scorched earth strategy that Vercingetorix implements represents radical departure from Celtic military tradition, while demonstrating understanding of Roman logistical vulnerabilities that previous resistance movements have failed to exploit systematically. The Oppida that Celtic hands destroy, their granaries burned and populations evacuated, deny Roman armies the local resources that enable sustained campaigning in territories beyond established supply lines. The systematic destruction that Celtic forces conduct, eliminating everything that might sustain Roman occupation, while preserving nothing that sentiment might protect, reflects strategic discipline that subordinates immediate interests to long-term objectives in ways that Celtic individualism has never previously achieved. The psychological dimension of Vercingetorix's leadership transcends military calculation to embrace spiritual authority that druids recognize as fulfillment of ancient prophecies about Celtic revival under divinely chosen king. The rituals that consecrate his assumption of supreme command, conducted in groves where oak trees shelter altars stained with centuries of sacrifice, invoke supernatural support while binding tribal loyalties through religious obligation that transcends political convenience. The sacred symbols that accompany Gallic armies, the boar standards that represent Celtic courage, the torques that proclaim noble blood, and the weapons blessed by priests whose knowledge spans generations of oral tradition, transform military resistance into holy war whose spiritual significance matches its political importance. The intelligence network that enables coordinated Celtic operations across territories spanning hundreds of miles demonstrates organizational sophistication that Roman administrative methods have consistently underestimated, while revealing communication capabilities that tribal simplicity supposedly preclude. The messengers who carry Vercingetorix's orders through forest paths and mountain passes unknown to Roman maps, the signals that coordinate attacks across multiple fronts simultaneously, and the supply arrangements that sustain guerrilla operations without fixed bases reflect logistical planning that matches Roman efficiency while exploiting local knowledge that foreign armies cannot replicate. The information that flows to Celtic command centers, detailing Roman movements and defensive preparations with precision that suggests sources within Roman camps themselves, creates tactical advantages that previous tribal resistance has never possessed. The guerrilla warfare that Vercingetorix employs against Roman columns, struggling through territories where every hill might conceal ambush and every forest could hide coordinated assaults, represents tactical innovation that neutralizes Roman advantages while exploiting Celtic strengths in ways that formal battle cannot achieve. The hit-and-run attacks that harass Roman supply trains, the night raids that strike isolated detachments, and the constant harassment that prevents rest while consuming ammunition and morale demonstrate warfare adapted to territorial defense rather than conquest. The Roman responses that such tactics provoke, burning villages and executing hostages in attempts to intimidate civilian populations, create martyrs whose deaths strengthen resistance while revealing imperial brutality that undermines propaganda about Roman civilization. The siege of Gergovia, that crowns Vercingetorix's strategic achievement, represents Caesar's first major defeat in Gallic warfare, while demonstrating Celtic capability to coordinate defensive operations that exploit geographical advantages through tactical innovation and superior knowledge of local conditions. The Arverni capital that perches atop volcanic cliffs whose natural strength defies Roman siege techniques receives reinforcement through tribal cooperation that brings warriors from territories spanning central Gaul. The defensive preparations that Celtic engineers conduct, adapting Roman fortification principles to native architectural traditions, while incorporating obstacles that challenge imperial military science. The assault that Caesar launches against Gergovia's defenses represents tactical desperation disguised as strategic confidence. His recognition that prolonged siege operations in hostile territory without secure supply lines risk catastrophic failure that would encourage tribal resistance throughout Gaul. The legions that advance up volcanic slopes against positions where Celtic defenders enjoy every advantage except technological superiority suffer casualties that veteran formations can ill afford, while achieving gains that fail to justify losses. The repulse that follows, sending Roman forces retreating down slopes littered with equipment that Celtic warriors claim as trophies, provides propaganda victory that resonates throughout Gaul as proof that Roman invincibility exists only in imperial imagination. The political consequences that flow from Gergovia's successful defense transform regional rebellion into national uprising, as tribes that have maintained neutrality or Roman alliance recognize opportunity for successful resistance against imperial authority whose military reputation has suffered irreparable damage. The Aedui, whose client status provided model for Roman administrative control, abandon collaboration in favor of independence that promises restoration of traditional autonomy. The Germanic tribes whose Rhine crossings have created periodic crises offer military assistance that strengthens Celtic resistance, while threatening Roman positions from multiple directions simultaneously. The personal leadership that Vercingetorix demonstrates during Gergovia's siege, fighting beside common warriors while sharing dangers that aristocratic tradition might allow him to avoid, creates bonds of loyalty that transcend traditional Celtic social hierarchies, while establishing precedents for unified command that tribal individualism has never previously accepted. The young king, whose courage matches his strategic vision, earns devotion that enables coordination across tribal boundaries, while his tactical innovations demonstrate adaptation of Roman military science to Celtic conditions. The reputation that emerges from successful defense spreads throughout Gaul as evidence that Celtic leadership can match Roman generalship when supported by unified resistance. The momentum that Gergovia's defense creates enables expansion of rebellion into territories that have remained loyal to Roman authority, while providing strategic base for operations that threaten Roman control throughout central Gaul. The tribal levies that flock to Vercingetorix's standards, bringing weapons and equipment that represent mobilization of Celtic military potential on unprecedented scales, create armies whose size compensates for individual tactical disadvantages through numerical superiority that Roman forces cannot match. The coordination that enables simultaneous attacks on Roman positions across multiple fronts demonstrates organizational capabilities that challenge imperial assumptions about barbarian limitation. The strategic situation that emerges from successful resistance around Gergovia places Caesar in tactical position more dangerous than any he has faced since arriving in Gaul, surrounded by hostile populations while operating beyond secure supply lines that Roman logistics require for sustained operations. The legions that have suffered casualties throughout the campaigning season find themselves outnumbered by enemies whose coordination and tactical innovation neutralize traditional Roman advantages, while exploiting weaknesses that Mediterranean experience has never required commanders to address. The political pressure that accumulates in Rome as news of defeats reaches ears already sensitive to criticism about Gallic expenditures creates additional constraints on military options. The transformation that Vercingetorix has achieved, uniting Celtic peoples through shared resistance while adapting traditional warfare to exploit Roman vulnerabilities, represents a historical moment when tribal culture demonstrates capacity for political evolution that imperial propaganda claims barbarian societies cannot achieve. The king, whose vision encompasses liberation of all Gaul from foreign domination, embodies Celtic potential that Roman administrative efficiency has systematically attempted to suppress through divide and rule policies designed to prevent exactly such unification. The rebellion that spreads throughout Gaul like wildfire carries implications that extend beyond immediate military concerns to embrace fundamental questions about imperial capability to maintain control over peoples whose political sophistication matches their martial courage. The sacred flame that burns in druidical groves where priests invoke divine blessing for Celtic independence illuminates struggle that transcends immediate political objectives to embrace cultural survival against imperial system whose expansion eliminates alternative civilizations through administrative absorption rather than military destruction. The war that Vercingetorix leads represents final opportunity for Celtic Europe to preserve independence through unified resistance before Roman efficiency completes cultural transformation that will reduce tribal peoples to provincial populations, serving imperial rather than indigenous interests. The fortress of Alesia rises from the Burgundian plateau like an altar consecrated to the gods of war, its limestone cliffs ascending toward heavens that will witness the final confrontation between Celtic independence and Roman imperial destiny. Upon this sacred mountain, where druids once conducted rituals that bound earth to sky through human sacrifice, Vercingetorix has chosen to make his ultimate stand, with 80,000 warriors whose bronze shields reflect autumn sunlight, while their war cries echo across valleys that have known Celtic freedom since time immemorial. The Arverni king, his strategic genius tested through months of guerrilla warfare that brought Rome to the edge of defeat, now commits everything to pitched battle that will determine whether Gaul dies free or lives enslaved. The decision to concentrate Celtic resistance at Alesia represents a calculated gamble that transforms Vercingetorix's greatest strength, unified command over tribal confederation, into potential weakness through geographic concentration that enables Roman siege techniques to neutralize numerical advantages. The hilltop fortress that crowns this ancient oppidum, its walls strengthened through generations of Mandubii engineering, while its granaries hold supplies for extended resistance, offers defensive position that Celtic military tradition considers impregnable. Yet the same geological features that provide protection against conventional assault also create isolation that Roman logistics might exploit through patient investment rather than direct attack. Caesar's recognition of tactical opportunity that Alesia's geography provides demonstrates strategic vision that transforms apparent disadvantage into decisive advantage through systematic application of Roman engineering capabilities to siege conditions where Celtic courage cannot overcome material limitations. The legions that encircle Alesia's base, their entrenching tools working with mechanical precision that characterizes Roman military efficiency, begin construction of circumvallation works whose scale dwarfs previous siege operations, while their complexity reflects tactical innovation adapted to unique geographical challenges. The investment that follows represents more than military blockade. It embodies imperial determination to resolve Gallic resistance through systematic application of superior resources and organizational capability. The double walls that emerge from Roman engineering effort represent a masterpiece of military architecture, whose innovation solves tactical problems that conventional siege methods cannot address, when defending forces receive external support from relieving armies. The inner wall that faces Alesia's defenders, strengthened with towers and artillery positions that dominate approaches to Celtic fortifications, maintains pressure on besieged garrison while preventing sorties that might disrupt Roman operations. The outer wall that faces Gallic countryside, its design incorporating lessons learned from previous encounters with Celtic relief forces, creates defensive position where Roman legions can resist assault from multiple directions, while maintaining siege pressure against primary objective. The engineering challenges that double circumvallation presents test Roman technical capabilities, while demonstrating institutional knowledge that enables systematic solutions to unprecedented problems through adaptation of established principles to novel conditions. The earthworks that connect inner and outer walls, their design channeling water while providing covered movement for defenders, reflect understanding of siege dynamics that Celtic warfare has never developed. The obstacles that Roman engineers place between wall systems, hidden pits with sharpened stakes, entangled barriers that channel attackers into killing zones, and artificial swamps that eliminate cavalry effectiveness, create defensive depth that multiply Roman advantages while exploiting Celtic tactical limitations. The civilian population, trapped within Alesia's walls, faces starvation that transforms military siege into humanitarian crisis, as food supplies diminish while relief operations fail to materialize according to expected timetables. The women and children whose presence complicates military decision-making represent burden that Celtic warrior culture cannot abandon, while their consumption of limited provisions creates pressure for tactical resolution that favors Roman patience over Celtic endurance. The council meetings that debate evacuation of non-combatants, sending them through Roman lines to certain death or slavery, reveal moral dilemmas that siege warfare creates when honor conflicts with survival. Vercingetorix's leadership during siege conditions that test every aspect of Celtic political unity demonstrates personal qualities that earn respect from enemies, while inspiring loyalty that transcends tribal boundaries among followers, whose hopes rest entirely on his strategic genius. The young king, whose vision united Gaul through shared resistance, maintains morale through personal example that shares hardships while his tactical innovations adapt Celtic warfare to siege conditions where traditional advantages disappear beneath Roman systematic pressure. The charisma that enabled political unification now serves to prevent despair that starvation and isolation might otherwise create among warriors whose families suffer within sight of their weapons. The relief army that assembles in response to Vercingetorix's summons represents final mobilization of Celtic military potential on scales that tribal warfare has never previously achieved, bringing together 250,000 warriors from territories spanning Gaul, while their coordination demonstrates organizational capabilities that Roman intelligence has consistently underestimated. The tribal levies that march toward Alesia carry hopes of peoples whose independence depends on successful relief, while their equipment reflects mobilization that has stripped Gallic communities of every available weapon. The political unity that such cooperation represents transcends immediate military objectives to embody Celtic cultural survival against imperial expansion that threatens traditional ways of life. The tactical coordination that enables simultaneous attacks from relief forces outside Roman walls and garrison troops within Alesia represents sophisticated planning that challenges Roman defensive capabilities while demonstrating Celtic adaptation to siege warfare through tactical inabilities that exploits Roman positional vulnerabilities. The signals that coordinate timing between separated forces, communicated through methods that Roman observation cannot intercept, reflect military organization that tribal simplicity supposedly precludes. The assault that follows tests Roman engineering against Celtic desperation, in combat that will determine imperial expansion's ultimate success or failure in northern Europe. The first relief attack that strikes Roman outer walls demonstrates Celtic capability to coordinate massive assaults, while revealing tactical limitations that numerical superiority cannot overcome against prepared defensive positions, strengthened by superior engineering and disciplined by professional military training. The waves of warriors that advance across open ground toward Roman fortifications, their courage unquestionable, but their coordination fragmenting under artillery fire that creates casualties faster than Celtic replacement can maintain assault momentum, discover limitations that traditional warfare has never encountered. The losses that accumulate during unsuccessful attacks represent irreplaceable depletion of tribal military resources, while Roman defensive capabilities remain largely intact. The night assault that relief commanders attempt as alternative to frontal attack reflects tactical adaptation that exploits darkness to neutralize Roman observational advantages, while creating confusion that might enable penetration of defensive systems through surprise rather than overwhelming force. The Celtic warriors, who advance through pre-dawn darkness, their movements guided by local knowledge that Roman defenders cannot match, achieve initial surprise that creates opportunities for tactical breakthrough. The hand-to-hand combat that develops when Roman discipline meets Celtic desperation in conditions where technological advantages disappear beneath individual courage tests fundamental military qualities that determine ultimate victory. Caesar's personal intervention during the critical moment when Celtic assault threatens to breach Roman defensive positions demonstrates leadership that transforms potential defeat into decisive victory through tactical innovation that exploits Roman advantages while inspiring legionary performance that exceeds normal human limitations. The scarlet cloak that identifies the Roman commander as he leads counterattack from reserve positions provides rallying point that enables coordinated response to Celtic penetration, while his presence among fighting ranks demonstrates shared risk that motivates extraordinary effort. The cavalry charge that Caesar leads against Celtic rear positions, striking from unexpected direction while relief forces commit to frontal assault, represents tactical genius that transforms defensive engagement into offensive opportunity. The slaughter that follows Roman tactical recovery eliminates Celtic relief capability, while demonstrating costs of challenging imperial military science through traditional methods inadequately adapted to siege conditions, where Roman advantages multiply through systematic preparation and superior coordination. The 60,000 Celtic warriors who die in failed relief attempts represent catastrophic loss of tribal military potential, while their weapons and equipment become Roman plunder that enriches legions whose professional competence has overcome barbarian numerical superiority. The survivors who flee toward territories beyond Roman immediate reach carry news of defeat that will discourage future resistance, while their demoralization infects communities whose hopes die beneath Alesia's walls. Vercingetorix's surrender, conducted with dignity that earns Roman respect, while his sacrifice preserves surviving warriors from pointless destruction, represents recognition that continued resistance serves only to multiply Celtic casualties without achieving political objectives that military defeat has rendered impossible. The ceremony that transfers Celtic war leader to Roman custody, his weapons laid down before assembly that includes representatives from tribes whose unity he created, marks transformation of resistance hero into imperial prisoner whose fate will serve Roman political purposes. The speech that accompanies surrender, delivered in Celtic tongue that Roman interpreters struggle to render accurately, expresses hopes for Gallic survival under imperial administration that might preserve cultural identity through accommodation rather than destruction. The political implications that flow from Alesia's fall extend beyond immediate military consequences to embrace fundamental transformation of Celtic Europe from independent tribal confederation into Roman provincial territory, whose administration will systematically eliminate alternative political possibilities through imperial efficiency. The fortress that witnessed Celtic freedom's final stand becomes symbol of Roman victory, whose psychological impact resonates throughout territories where tribal councils must now calculate survival through submission rather than resistance. The walls that Caesar constructed to contain Celtic independence become monument to imperial engineering, whose technical achievement matches its political significance in establishing Roman dominance over peoples whose martial courage could not overcome systematic application of superior resources and organizational capabilities. The smoke that rises from burning a Peda across Gaul carries more than timber and thatch towards skies that no longer shelter Celtic freedom. It bears the accumulated heritage of 1,000 generations, reduced to ash and memory. In the wake of Alesia's fall, Roman legions march through territories where resistance flickers like dying embers, their systematic efficiency transforming military victory into cultural extermination through administrative methods that leave no sanctuary for tribal traditions or sacred practices. The conquest that began with Helvetii migration has become genocide conducted with bureaucrat precision, its perpetrators recording casualties and captured wealth with same methodical care that characterizes tax collection and road construction. The druids who survive initial massacres flee towards sacred groves, where oak trees older than Rome itself have sheltered mysteries that bind Celtic peoples through shared spiritual obligation, transcending tribal boundaries. These priests, whose knowledge spans centuries of oral tradition, while their authority derives from supernatural sanction rather than political appointment, represent final obstacle to Roman cultural dominance that military victory alone cannot eliminate. Their sacred sites, hidden in forests where human sacrifice has sanctified earth through generations of ritual obligation, become targets for systematic destruction that employs fire and steel to eliminate religious practices that imperial administration considers incompatible with civilized governance. The final stand that druids make on Mona, the sacred island where Anglesey's priests maintain the most ancient learning of the Celtic world, represents desperate attempt to preserve knowledge that Roman cultural imperialism seeks to eliminate through systematic destruction of alternative intellectual traditions. The warriors who defend druidical sanctuaries fight with desperation that transcends normal military calculation, their resistance strengthened by religious conviction that transforms tactical defeat into spiritual victory through martyrdom that preserves sacred obligations. The groves that burn under Roman torches, their flames consuming libraries of human memory preserved through all traditions spanning millennia, represent cultural catastrophe whose magnitude exceeds mere political conquest. The systematic hunts that Roman auxiliary forces conduct, tracking surviving druids through forests and mountains where Celtic resistance maintains final refugees, demonstrate imperial determination to eliminate religious leadership that might inspire future rebellion through spiritual authority that political accommodation cannot co-opt or control. The rewards that Caesar offers for druidical capture, payments that exceed annual wages for skilled craftsmen, reflect strategic understanding that Celtic culture cannot survive destruction of priestly class, whose knowledge preserves tribal identity through traditions that predate Roman historical memory. The executions that follow successful captures, conducted in public ceremonies designed to demonstrate imperial power over supernatural authority, serve as object lessons about consequences of maintaining alternative spiritual allegiances. The enslavement operations that follow military pacification represent logistical undertaking whose scale dwarfs previous Roman experience, while demonstrating efficiency that transforms human beings into commodities through systematic application of administrative procedures developed for managing conquered populations. The slave markets that emerge in newly constructed Roman towns process Celtic captives with mechanical precision that reduces individual identities to demographic categories useful for imperial economic planning. The 1 million Gauls whose freedom disappears into Mediterranean auction blocks represent wealth that finances Roman expansion, while providing labor that builds infrastructure serving imperial rather than indigenous needs. The children who survive family destruction through separation, that Roman slave dealers conduct as standard practice, face cultural annihilation more complete than physical death through forced assimilation that eliminates Celtic identity through systematic destruction of linguistic and religious inheritance. The young Gauls, whose Celtic names disappear beneath Latin appellations assigned by Roman masters, lose connection to tribal genealogies and spiritual traditions that previously defined personal identity within community context. The education that some receive, designed to create useful servants rather than preserve indigenous culture, complete psychological conquest that military force initiated through systematic replacement of Celtic worldview with Roman imperial ideology. The sacred sites that Celtic peoples have maintained through generations of ritual obligation face destruction that extends beyond immediate military necessity to embrace cultural warfare designed to eliminate alternative spiritual authority through systematic desecration of holy places whose power derives from landscapes sanctified by centuries of sacrifice. The stone circles, whose astronomical alignments preserve Celtic understanding of cosmic cycles, disappear beneath Roman road construction that treats ancient monuments as quarries, providing convenient building materials. The springs, whose waters have received offerings since time immemorial, receive Roman temples whose classical architecture replaces Celtic sacred geometry with imperial aesthetic that serves political rather than spiritual purposes. The languages that disappear as Celtic communities face dispersal through enslavement and forced relocation represent irreplaceable loss of human knowledge, whose complexity reflects intellectual achievement that Roman cultural prejudices dismiss as barbarian simplicity, unworthy of preservation. The dialects that once enabled communication across tribal boundaries fragment into isolated remnants, as speakers find themselves scattered across territories where survival requires adoption of Latin for basic commercial and administrative interaction. The oral traditions that preserved historical memory, legal precedents, and mythological understanding face extinction as communities that maintain such knowledge through collective memory suffer disruption that makes cultural transmission impossible. The economic transformation that follows conquest converts Celtic territories from independent political entities into Roman resource extraction zones, whose production serves imperial rather than indigenous needs, while systematic exploitation eliminates traditional relationships between communities and landscapes that sustained Celtic civilization. The mines that Roman engineers open, employing enslaved Celtic labor to extract minerals that finance further imperial expansion, represent environmental destruction whose scale exceeds anything tribal peoples practice through sustainable resource management. The agricultural reorganization that reduces Celtic farmers to tenant laborers on estates serving Roman market demands destroys subsistence patterns that maintain community autonomy through local self-sufficiency. The resistance that persists in remote territories where geographical obstacles provide temporary sanctuary against Roman administrative penetration faces systematic elimination through military operations that employ local knowledge purchased through collaboration with tribal elements, whose loyalty depends on accommodation with imperial authority. The mountain strongholds that shelter final Celtic independence movements become targets for siege operations whose success reflects Roman engineering capabilities adapted to terrain that previous enemies have found impregnable. The warriors who die defending such positions represent final generation that remembers Gaul before conquest transformed Celtic territories into Roman provinces, serving imperial rather than tribal interests. The administrative efficiency that Roman government applies to newly conquered territories demonstrates systematic approach to cultural transformation that eliminates alternative political possibilities through bureaucratic methods whose effectiveness exceeds military force in achieving permanent imperial control. The census operations that register Celtic populations for taxation purposes also identify individuals whose skills, property, or political influence might serve Roman administrative needs, through collaboration that offers personal survival in exchange for cultural betrayal. The legal systems that replace tribal law with Roman jurisprudence eliminate traditional authority structures while creating new hierarchies that reward accommodation with imperial values rather than preservation of indigenous customs. The roads that Roman engineers construct across territories that previously maintained independence through geographical isolation represent infrastructure that serves imperial logistics rather than Celtic commercial needs, while their straight lines ignore sacred landscapes whose spiritual significance tribal peoples have respected through generations of religious obligation. The military colonies that establish Roman presence in strategically important locations provide permanent reminder of imperial authority, while their veteran settlers demonstrate cultural replacement that eliminates Celtic demographic majorities through systematic immigration of loyal populations. The cities that emerge around administrative centres follow Roman urban planning that ignores traditional Celtic settlement patterns while imposing Mediterranean lifestyle upon peoples whose culture developed through different relationships with natural environment. The cultural synthesis that Roman administration promotes through selective preservation of Celtic elements deemed compatible with imperial ideology represents managed destruction that eliminates dangerous traditions while maintaining useful practices through systematic modification that serves Roman rather than Celtic purposes. The craftsmanship traditions that survive conquest undergo transformation that adapt Celtic technical knowledge to Roman aesthetic preferences, while their practitioners work for imperial markets rather than tribal communities whose previously sustained such skills. The festivals that continue under Roman supervision lose spiritual significance through bureaucratic regulation that transforms religious observances into secular entertainments, serving administrative convenience rather than sacred obligation. The generation that grows to maturity under Roman rule inherits territory whose Celtic identity survives only in geographical names, whose meanings become incomprehensible as linguistic assimilation eliminates knowledge of pre-conquest culture among populations whose education serves imperial rather than indigenous needs. The memories that persist in remote areas where Roman influence penetrates slowly face systematic erosion through economic pressure that makes traditional ways of life unsustainable, while offering material rewards for cultural accommodation that abandons ancestral practices in favor of imperial alternatives. The Gaul that Vercingetorix died defending disappears beneath Roman efficiency, whose success transforms conquest into colonization, that eliminates conquered peoples through absorption rather than extermination. The final accounting that Caesar conducts as Gallic pacification reaches completion records statistics that measure imperial achievement through demographic data whose precision reflects bureaucratic efficiency applied to human catastrophe. 1 million enslaved, territories covering modern France transformed into Roman provinces, and Celtic independence eliminated forever through systematic application of superior resources and organizational capabilities to cultural destruction that military victory enabled but administrative competence completed, through methods whose effectiveness would provide model for future imperial expansion into territories where alternative civilizations awaited similar transformation. The winter of 50 BC settles over Rome with unusual severity, its winds carrying rumors that freeze senatorial blood more thoroughly than mountain storms descending from alpine peaks, where Celtic peoples once maintained independence through geographical obstacles that Roman engineering has now overcome. In the marble corridors where Republic's fate hangs balanced between tradition and ambition, politicians whose careers depend on constitutional precedents receive reports from Gaul that describe wealth beyond previous imperial acquisition and military achievements that dwarf ancestral legends. Yet these same dispatches also detail the rise of a proconsul whose power threatens every assumption about magisterial limits that Roman law has established through centuries of careful balance between individual ambition and collective authority. Caesar's camp beyond the Rubicon grows daily more opulent through Gallic plunder, whose scale transforms military headquarters into imperial court, where former enemies serve as exotic decorations, while their treasures finance political operations that reach into every corner of Mediterranean civilization. The Tories of melted gold that once adorned Celtic nobles now provide currency for bribes that purchase loyalty throughout Italy, their bronze and silver companions feeding into monetary system that enables Caesar to maintain legions whose devotion depends on regular payment rather than patriotic sentiment. The 1 million slaves whose labor has become commodity for Roman markets generate revenues that dwarf traditional sources of senatorial wealth, while creating economic dependence that binds Italian communities to Gallic conquest through commercial relationships serving Caesar's political purposes. The reports that reach Rome from provincial administrators describe territories whose transformation exceeds anything achieved through previous imperial expansion, their Celtic populations reduced to agricultural labor serving Roman markets, while their oppida become construction sites for cities whose architecture proclaims imperial victory through classical forms imposed upon landscapes that once sheltered alternative civilization. The roads that span conquered territories, their engineering marvels connecting Atlantic shores to Rhine frontiers through infrastructure serving Roman logistics rather than indigenous needs, represent investment of Gallic wealth in permanent control systems whose strategic value transcends immediate military requirements. The cultural elimination that accompanies physical conquest, documented through administrative records that catalogue destroyed sacred sites and eliminated druidical practices, demonstrates systematic approach to imperial expansion that transforms conquest into colonization through methods whose effectiveness will provide template for future operations. Marcus Porcius Cato, whose Stoic principles mask political calculation sharper than any blade forged in Spanish workshops, reads intelligence reports whose details confirm his worst fears about proconsular power unchecked by constitutional restraints or senatorial oversight. The armies that Caesar commands, grown from traditional legions into personal instruments whose loyalty depends on continued success and regular enrichment, represent military force that threatens republican institutions through professional competence allied to individual ambition. The wealth that flows from Gallic conquests, estimated at revenues exceeding Rome's normal annual income for multiple years, provides resources that enable political independence from traditional funding sources while creating capabilities for sustained warfare against any opposition that constitutional authority might organize. The legal proceedings that Senate prepares against Caesar's conduct during his proconsulship reflect institutional attempt to maintain traditional boundaries between magisterial authority and personal power, while their specific charges address violations that precedent and law clearly define as criminal behavior warranting prosecution and punishment. The evidence that prosecutors have assembled, drawn from testimony of Gallic survivors and documentation of administrative irregularities, describes conduct that exceeds any previous definition of acceptable proconsular behavior, while establishing patterns of abuse that threaten provincial people's basic security under Roman protection. Yet the political realities that surround such legal proceedings reveal how thoroughly Gallic wealth has corrupted traditional checks on magisterial power through systematic bribery that transforms constitutional procedures into commercial transactions. The Rhine frontier that Caesar has established through 8 years of systematic warfare represents strategic boundary whose maintenance requires military presence, whose cost exceeds normal provincial revenues, while its strategic importance makes abandonment politically impossible for any administration that claims competence in frontier defense. The Germanic pressure that continues beyond the Great River manifests through periodic raids and diplomatic intelligence that describes tribal confederations whose military potential matches previous Celtic capabilities, creates permanent security challenges that demand professional armies rather than citizen militias whose service terms cannot accommodate extended frontier duty. The precedent that permanent military command establishes, justified through geographical necessity and validated through tactical success, threatens constitutional tradition that limits magisterial authority through temporal restrictions designed to prevent accumulation of personal power. The Gallic territories that provide foundation for Caesar's political independence represent wealth whose magnitude transforms republican politics through resources that enable sustained operations without dependence on traditional funding sources, controlled by senatorial authority or popular assemblies whose approval limits magisterial freedom of action. The tribute arrangements that generate annual revenues from pacified territories, the slave markets that process human plunder into liquid capital, and the mining operations that extract precious metals for monetary circulation, create economic empire whose productivity exceeds anything achieved through traditional conquest methods. The transformation that such wealth enables, converting military success into political independence, while providing material foundation for constitutional revolution, demonstrates how imperial expansion changes domestic institutions through resources that make traditional restraints obsolete. The constitutional crisis that emerges from Caesar's refusal to accept prosecution without military command reflects fundamental incompatibility between republican institutions designed for city-state governance and imperial responsibilities that require permanent professional armies serving individual commanders rather than collective authority. The precedent that Pompey's eastern commands established, granting extraordinary powers to individual generals for extended periods without meaningful oversight, created legal framework that enables similar grants while establishing expectations among ambitious politicians that exceptional circumstances justify exceptional measures. The competition that develops between rival commanders, each claiming constitutional authority while maintaining independent military forces, represents institutional breakdown that transforms political disagreement into potential civil warfare. The crossing that Caesar makes on January 10, 49 BC, leading a single legion across the shallow waters that separate Gallic command from Italian territory, represents decision whose consequences extend far beyond immediate political calculation to embrace fundamental transformation of Mediterranean civilization from republican confederation into imperial monarchy. The die that he casts with this action, committing himself and his followers to constitutional revolution, whose success depends on military victory rather than legal precedent, initiates civil warfare whose outcome will determine whether Roman expansion continues through traditional institutions or evolves into personal rule that eliminates republican constraints on imperial administration. The Gallic wealth that finances this gamble, the veteran loyalty that Celtic conquest has purchased, and the strategic advantages that 8 years of successful warfare have demonstrated, provide foundation for challenge to senatorial authority, whose resolution will reshape ancient world. The Celtic world whose destruction enabled Caesar's rise disappears into archaeological record as Roman administration completes cultural transformation that military conquest initiated through systematic elimination of alternative traditions that might preserve indigenous identity among subject populations. The languages that once enabled communication across tribal boundaries survive only in place names, whose meanings become incomprehensible as linguistic assimilation eliminates Celtic linguistic inheritance among populations whose education serves imperial rather than tribal needs. The sacred sites that anchored Celtic spiritual life beneath Roman temples whose classical architecture replaces indigenous sacred geometry with imperial aesthetics serving political rather than religious purposes, demonstrate thoroughness of cultural replacement that transforms conquest into permanent absorption. The historical significance that Gallic conquest achieves extends beyond immediate political consequences to embrace fundamental transformation of European civilization through methods that eliminate alternative cultural possibilities while establishing precedents for imperial expansion that will shape future development throughout continent whose peoples await similar incorporation into Mediterranean political and economic systems. The efficiency that Roman administration demonstrates in converting independent Celtic territories into productive provincial units provides model for systematic conquest and absorption that future emperors will employ against Germanic, Dacian, and British peoples, whose resistance will face identical methods of cultural elimination through administrative competence allied to military superiority. The Europe that emerges from Celtic destruction bears Roman imprint whose permanence reflects systematic approach to imperial expansion that transforms conquest into colonization through cultural replacement rather than simple political domination. The legacy that 8 years of Gallic warfare creates, measured in human cost whose magnitude challenges moral calculation, while its strategic success validates methods that future imperial expansion will systematically employ, establishes patterns of conquest and absorption that will characterize Roman expansion until external pressure or internal decay eliminates imperial capability to maintain such systematic control over subject populations whose alternative cultural traditions disappear beneath administrative efficiency, whose effectiveness depend on elimination of indigenous political and religious authority through methods that Caesar's Gallic campaigns perfected through practical application, whose martial courage could not overcome systemic application of superior resources and organizational capabilities.